Afternoon to everyone, and thank you to Lisa and the SEAL program for inviting me here. I barely made it in the nick of time, but I couldn't refuse Lisa. It would be on my conscience if I did. Uh, Listening to the report of Lisa this afternoon really impressed me in the way it provided very reliable data on the social enterprise sector, particularly in the Philippines. And I commend them for the attempt of the study to capture the important aspects and dimensions and characteristics of social enterprise in a multi-country comparative context as an input to the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. Let me now go to my observations. I read it in a hurry because this was not going to be my part in this program, but Lisa told me to react to the study, which I really welcome because I have had a chance to look at and examine the findings. My observations will be confined to the gender dimensions of the study, as this is the area I'm most interested in. I think it is clear at the outset that social enterprises overall here and elsewhere in the world adhere to the notion that poverty reduction and shared prosperity can only be achieved with the full economic participation of men and women. This is a well-established fact borne out by research, notably by the World Bank, ADB, and by feminist economists such as Karen Gron, Sergio Floro, Diane Elson, and many feminist economics that have made great contributions to these studies. Almost 1 billion women have the potential to contribute more fully to their economies, but are unable to do so. Of these, 812 million live in the developing world, where their contributions as workers and job creators is greatest. This is the same situation that the study found out, that the study examined. While women had great strides in education, political representation, and campaigns against violence against women, by the way, this today is the beginning of the 16th day of against violence on women, and I'll explain the relationship of this issue to social enterprise later. Many women still lag behind in terms of economic empowerment, in employment, business, and in terms of leadership in big companies. However, there seems to be a lot of evidence now that women are better represented in small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as in management of their own small business ventures. The inclusion of women empowerment and gender equality in the objectives of the study in all three countries is a recognition of the important role of women in social enterprises, primarily because whereas these initiatives target the poor in general, women, in fact, are the poorest of the poor. So in defining the poor, the study could have used sex disaggregated data that might have yielded a better nuanced view of the gender differentiation of the poor in terms of their legal rights, that then also impacts on their access to resources and capacity to engage in social enterprises, which were actually hinted in some parts of the study, but was not fully developed. I thought that was a very interesting insight that I found in many sections. For instance, in many countries, not exactly in the Philippines as well as in Indonesia, but more in Bangladesh, that women who cannot own and inherit land, property, and assets have less capacity to start any economic venture, enter into contracts, register businesses in their own names, or even to apply for loans. So this is a major issue about about such enterprises. How can women enjoy all the benefits of social enterprise with all these legal, customary, and social constraints? A gender lens throughout the study could have provided an analysis of how women and men affect and are affected differently by policies, programs, projects, and activities. A gender perspective, in fact, can yield differentiation in gender roles, in social and economic roles, in relationship and needs, access to resources, and other constraints, opportunities, and challenges imposed by culture, age, religion, social norms on both women and men. For instance, the presence or absence of family planning clinics and services in the community, the absence or presence of child minding centers can make all the difference, whether or not women can even engage in social enterprises, let alone for full-time jobs. In the Philippines, for instance, the prolonged debates on the reproductive health law, and the closure of family planning clinics in Manila by the then city mayor Atienza, which has one of the heaviest concentration of poor households, meant that women have more children, more they are able to support or care to have. An important data in one of the tables, I forgot what table it was now, showed that the average age of CEOs, women CEOs, was between 40 to 60 years old, which can imply that women can only be fully engaged in social enterprises when they are past childbearing age. Also, as a consequence of women's involvement in economic empowerment, some studies and some frontline activists have noticed that there are unforeseen developments, like, for instance, when a woman attends seminars and skills training, the chances are the husband would get jealous. Among others, because she would be exposed to a greater number of men, or that she would have this economic power that a man might not be able to have. So the consequence would be that there would be some violence against women happening in the household. So I think this is an important input that needs to be looked into if you are going to rely on women and to look at capability for women. We should examine her social, domestic environment, and also the attitudes and beliefs of men in actually promoting the participation of their wives or their sisters or women in their families. Table 10 reveals another important data about the participation of women in SEPs. Overwhelmingly, women represented 71% in the Philippines represented in SE's governance structure. This is a very important data that you have captured, Lisa, because it implies that more than just the increasing numbers of women in governance, it actually implies that there are factors that contribute to the success of women in terms of governance. And that could be, comparatively in Bangladesh and Indonesia, although all three of them profess gender equality as a major objective, a deeper analysis would reveal that legal rights on ownership of land, assets, inheritance rights, protection from violence against women in the private and public spaces, as well as the influence, and this is an important point in terms of the activism of women's movements, as well as national machineries, which provide the legal and institutional framework for women's empowerment. So I think that's something that can be studied further. For instance, the Philippines stands as the only Asian country that have made great strides in closing the gender gap in the last 10 years, according to the Gender Gap Index. In contrast, Bangladesh and Indonesia might have some constraining impacts in terms of the growing Muslim conservative agenda, which I have heard from my sisters in Indonesia and Bangladesh, that have been publicly challenging gender equality laws and policies, and where practices like compulsory wearing of the veil and limitations on women's leadership and equality have been observed. Mention was also made about the contribution of remittances in building social enterprises. I think this is a missed area of inquiry in the study, and might have been one of the limitations. All three countries have large numbers of migrants to the Middle East, and some countries in Asia, such as Hong Kong, Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore. Philippines and Indonesia are among the top 2 countries that are sending women migrant workers, and therefore are contributing to the assets of the families and communities. Migration in the Philippines, for instance, brings in about $32 billion in the Philippine economy, and that's not, a small amount. And a great part of this is also invested in micro and medium-scale social enterprises, maybe transactional, of the transactional type. This is an important area that may be done in the next phase of the study. I'm assuming there's a second phase, as migration seems to be almost a semi-permanent option of the poor in all 3 countries. They say that there are several options for the poor to be lifted out of poverty, and the first one of them that seems to be emerging in all 3 countries is migration. It used to be education, it's been replaced by migration, education, and of course, small-scale and micro enterprises. Other models of social enterprise experimentation. I think I'd like to mention something that's happening in the Philippines, and this is the Great Women Project. The Great Women Project means gender-responsive economic actions for the transformation of women, which I think falls under what Lisa termed a strategic partnership of government, the private sector, and communities. It uses the convergence approach, wherein all stakeholders are put together in producing outcomes for women's economic empowerment. The Great Women Projects works with national, provincial, and local governments, and involves agencies, especially economic and trade agencies, in 7 provinces and 36 municipalities by, among other things, developing coordinated laws, policies, programs, and services for women that support women micro-entrepreneurs, including family planning, and as I said, awareness on the rights of women, particularly on violence against women. And second, increased access to information, credit, loans, and new technologies and markets. This is, I think, the first step towards the stage of business incubation. Women involved in the project said that it is only now that they have been invited to planning sessions by the local government. This is linking government initiatives with individual economic initiatives of women. One participant said that it's not just a program coming from the top and being fed to us. We are participants, active participants, actually, to shaping what is important for my community and for my own locality. Speaking of the poor and where they are, I think it's important that such enterprises start off with the people first before a management committee coming in. So this has, I think this needs bears watching because it has already made some great strides, and it has, through the efforts of the owner of Figaro and one business enterprise of women, already made the point of linking the community products to the global market. They had an exhibition in New York just recently. The findings of the research, I think, are very, very welcome. Among others, they have concluded that the enhancement of the WELL framework, of the Women Empowerment Framework, needs to be strengthened, needs to be enhanced, and I might add, have to use the gender lens and gender analysis in its approach across all the projects and programs. And the strategic partnership idea is, I think, fantastic. The research findings suggest that there is still significant room for improving entrepreneurship support programs for SEPs by offering, among others, mentoring, networking, and other services, which include, as I mentioned, what you might call peripheral services. But for women, there are central services, like family planning, child minding, even crisis centers or counseling. And it's not just for women, by the way. Women, these programs must include the participation of men if beliefs and attitudes are to be changed. In addition to education on basic business practices and strengthening critical areas, I think one needs to also identify some of these particular areas as inclusion to the recommendations. One is the engendering of programs more effectively in order to overcome some of the constraints stemming from social norms and gender-specific challenges and constraints. The second is supporting women entrepreneurs to cross over into higher value-added and more productive activities. This is where government linkages, as well as linkages with funding donors, are critical. The third is addressing legal and institutional constraints, both for men and women, actually, but especially for women who are less endowed with legal rights. And fourth, strengthening innovation and the creativity, as well as the use of technology. In the report, they made mention about new emerging forms of social enterprise that mainly involves the young people. Young women in particular have been observed to use a lot of IT technology in the startup business. So I think this could be one of the areas that might be covered by the next study or for further study. In conclusion, I think that the study itself is a major contribution to this area of field of study, but that it should, that any study in future should have, a much more comprehensive gender approach, and that central to the issue of economic empowerment of women is a holistic understanding of her situation, her needs, her constraints, as well as her capabilities. I think no less than the recognition that gender equality is business, makes good business sense, must be the motto for all of us. Thank you.